Day zero is the moment before company formation, when a founder decides to take the plunge, follow their dream, and commit to pursuing their vision of change. On day zero, you'll hear founders tell their story.
Well, good afternoon, Julie, and welcome.
Thanks so much for having me, Gary.
We're pleased to have you at this microphone, and we appreciate your joining the advisory committee for Day Zero. The advisory committee members are founders as well as investors and experts. Of course, you qualify as all three of those, so that's good news. And what we've asked our advisory committee to do, in addition to giving us guidance on our agenda, is to host interviews with founders. And so you actually have the first episode and the second episode of Day Zero. So we appreciate that.
Of course.
What we'd like to do is to get to know you a bit better. One question I'd like to ask, Julie, is what was life like growing up for you?
Yeah, such a profound question. So I was the child of two immigrants who came to the U.S. for graduate studies from Korea back in the 70s. And, so really kind of typical, in some ways, a typical immigrant life at the beginning. We lived in the Washington, D.C. area. I was actually born in Providence, Rhode Island. My parents were at Brown University. And then we lived in D.C. Growing up. And I honestly did not speak English until I got to kindergarten because my parents just spoke Korean to me at home. My kindergarten teacher thought I had special needs, educationally speaking. So it's because I couldn't speak the language. But, very quickly got acclimated to, the language and the culture. So grew up like sort of in the burbs, typical suburban life in the U.S. But probably one of the most significant moments of my childhood was when my parents decided to move back to Korea when I was in late elementary school. And so we made a very, transformational move, across the world, literally, to Seoul, South Korea, where I attended middle school through high school. And it was, culture shock doesn't convey the level of change that represented to my life, both, kind of personally, as well as obviously from an educational perspective. In retrospect, the greatest thing my parents could have done for me, because I ended up going to an international school that had students from, I think it was like 30 different countries across the world. And it's, just people who I would have never had the opportunity to engage with, cultures I would have never had exposure to that early in life. And so, again, in retrospect, it was truly kind of eye-opening, and I think really drove a lot of kind of the global perspective that I have on opportunities, and kind of the open-mindedness that I hope people think I bring to everything I've done since then. But in any case, kind of finished high school there. It was kind of a foregone conclusion that I would come back to the U.S. for school, and I wanted to be a doctor when I grew up. So this was sort of the late 90s. Applied to a number of schools, one of which was MIT. I was also kind of a science engineering geek at heart. And so there was a lot that appealed to me about kind of the ethos of the MIT culture and the educational system. So I ended up going to MIT as an undergrad, initially to do pre-med. So actually was a biology major when I first arrived. This again was the late 90s. Maybe not all of our listeners will recall because they're too young, but that was obviously the first sort of like .com boom, the internet era. And when I arrived at MIT, of all places, of course, that was kind of the center of like computer science innovation around the big explosion around the internet and software in general. And so very much got swept up into that, which I'm grateful for. Ended up finishing my pre-med requirements, but also did computer science. And that was kind of the beginnings of my personal passion for the intersection of the two areas, healthcare and technology. When I graduated, there was no such thing as digital health back then. I think had there been a digital health industry, it's probably where I would have gone. But ended up doing sort of software engineering out of college. In a non-healthcare domain. I was building e-commerce technology back then, and for several years, worked at this startup. That's the other thing I would kind of highlight is, much to my parents' chagrin, I, for some reason, always gravitated towards startups, and I wanted to work at a startup. And my parents, they basically begged me to like interview for a job at IBM and Microsoft just to kind of check the box. And I ended up getting offers from those two companies, they like ran back and told all my relatives that I was going to work at IBM. And, I had to kind of call my parents and be like, so just so you know, I'm actually not going to go to IBM. I'm going to go to this 20-person company that you've never heard of that has an office in the basement of a building in Kendall Square, Cambridge.
Your poor parents.
Yeah. That company ended up actually getting acquired for $1 billion. So they, after the fact, were very, very pleased with my decision making and my independence and
Right.
conviction to kind of go against their will. So I kind of grew up in the kind of the tech ecosystem of Boston. Made a career change into healthcare by way of grad school, right around when the government was starting to talk about meaningful use and high tech and really kind of the opportunity to digitize care delivery, and have never looked back since. And I'm sure we'll talk more about kind of my experiences since then, but that's the quick version of my upbringing.
Yeah, I mean that's a great story for America and for Korea, actually. So, what about Kyruus? That was your first co-founder status, I believe. Is that right? What gave you
Correct.
the idea for co-founding Kyruus?
Yeah. So, as I mentioned, I always wanted to be in startups. So, kind of had the privilege of, kind of growing up in these companies from the ground floor, seeing these exceptional founders, build something from nothing, and it was extremely inspiring. And I just knew that I wanted to do it at some point. I did a couple of healthcare startups out of grad school just to kind of cut my teeth on the industry because I frankly knew that I just needed to learn the domain and had enough modesty and humility to know that I wanted to learn from others who kind of understood the space before trying it on my own. It just so happened that the company right before Kyruus, one of the co-founders there was Graham Gardner, who ultimately became my co-founder at Kyruus. And so he and I had the chance to work together. We ended up selling that company to CVS. And we kind of looked at each other and said, hey, that was fun. Like, let's do it again. And, the idea behind Kyruus. So I've been obsessed with how do you kind of apply technology to supply-demand mismatch problems? That's been like a theme across every company that I've worked at, every product I've worked at, or product I've built or worked on. And, we sort of married that to Graham's experience as a clinician when he said, gosh, one of my experiences as a cardiologist was that patients would wait 8 weeks to see me. He was a very fancy Harvard doctor working at the Beth Israel. Patients would queue up to kind of get an appointment with him. They would show up only to be told that he was the wrong kind of cardiologist, that they actually need to be re-referred to a different type of subspecialty because the person making the referral maybe was like Graham's friend from medical school, didn't really have detailed information about what exactly his area of subspecialty practice was, or just it was someone who went to the hospital website and kind of on a whim picked his name out of, amongst all other cardiologists. And so, we said, gosh, that is a supply-demand mismatch problem, right? You've got patient demand that has a specific need, but doesn't have the appropriate information at the point of referral to, kind of steer to the most appropriate care option. And so, from that was born this concept of Kyruus, which was ultimately a patient-provider matching platform that the closest analogy that I used to explain what the system did was it was kind of akin to the Sabre system in travel, which was the mainframe system that, agents would use to book flight inventories across multiple carriers. And so it was kind of an engine that aggregated seat inventory from across multiple airlines. It had logic for pricing those seats under certain circumstances and, for different classes. And then ultimately the booking engine that would, sort of book that seat on behalf of the consumer. And that's essentially what we ended up building at Kyruus was a system that would aggregate appointment inventory across multiple provider groups, create the logic and the routing engine to match a patient to the right provider based on literally dozens of different criteria in real time, and then ultimately book inventory into the underlying scheduling systems. And I say that I describe it so simply. It was anything but simple in terms of figuring out, the appropriate insertion point into the industry, into the buyer set, into the technical infrastructure that was, necessary to integrate with over many, many years of work and effort that we did there. But it was quite literally the best thing I've ever done in my life, and ended up being a tremendous ride for about 8 years for me.
Yeah, it'll be foundational going forward too. So congratulations on that. After having worked around venture capital for off and on, I would guess for a number of years, pretty much throughout your career, you decided to join Andreessen Horowitz, a preeminent venture capital firm. What caused that decision, Julie? What was the driver there?
So I had actually, it was funny, my co-founder Graham had previously been a venture capitalist, and I told him famously many, many years ago that I never wanted to be a VC. I always wanted to be an operator, and the fun with the action was all kind of on that side of the table. So when I stepped down from Kyruus, I actually moved out west with the desire, the intention to start another company, frankly. And so came out west, was essentially networking, connected with the firm here, and kind of at that time, Andreessen Horowitz didn't have a dedicated healthcare practice. They had a number of opportunistic investments in the space that had done quite well, but didn't have a dedicated effort, and they were just on the cusp of raising a new fund, and got to conviction that actually healthcare is the next big subsector that they wanted to kind of go after in a big way. And so they said, Julie, like first of all the partners at the firm are pretty much ex-founders, so there was a very specific archetype of person that they were looking to bring on to kind of spearhead that effort. I initially, sort of signed on almost in kind of a consulting type capacity to help build out the thesis. But I said, I kept saying, guys, like once I figure out what I want to build, I'm going to go build that, and then I'll help you kind of hire in the team, and you can go, we can go our separate ways. Long story short, I completely fell in love with the value proposition of this platform. Again, we're ex-founders and operators. In my experience, I had wonderful investors, but they were all financial investors who had not necessarily operated companies. And so the fundamental sort of lens and just the nature of the dialogue that my partners bring to the boardroom was just completely different than what I experienced in the past. And I thought that was such a special, unique value proposition. And our platform approach, we have a pretty extensive platform where we, basically our whole premise is that we want to endow, first-time founders with superpowers that would otherwise take them decades to build on their own from day one, in the form of both expertise as well as access to networks. And that as we all know, like the biggest challenge with healthcare companies is distribution. And so this notion of how can you build a network-based approach to plugging companies in and reducing friction to distribution from day one as a competitive advantage was extremely compelling. So again, long story short, ended up saying, gosh, what a privilege it would be to sort of be in this platform building a really differentiated new kind of product, so to speak, for founders to be able to back the next generation of digital health and health tech companies. So made the leap and haven't looked back since.
So the High Tech Act spent roughly $35 billion to digitize medicine. And most people thought that this decade would be the decade where we'd see that actually begin to pay off. What is the supply of founders like these days? I mean, you've got the longitudinal view of this going back 10 or 20 years. Yeah. What's the supply of founders these days, Julie?
Yeah, it's such a great question, because I think that's like one of the unique aspects of timing of why right now is such a unique moment in time in healthcare. So for the first time, it used to be the case, like when I was a founder, I was, a kind of tech native founder. I never had experience really in healthcare prior. And so I was kind of coming in from the tech lens. And then, of course, you had folks like Graham who were coming from the clinical side, had kind of the healthcare delivery experience, but not the tech lens. And, that was a big challenge. I would say there was a huge culture clash. If you remember the first wave of,
Yep.
folks coming in from tech saying, we're going to
Yep.
fix healthcare,
Yep.
why are you guys so dumb and can't figure this out? But, didn't have the appropriate level of both hubris and just,
Right.
willingness to kind of dive deep into the laws of physics of healthcare to really get it right. Now you have this unique, I call them digital health native founders. So because we now have a robust number of publicly traded companies in digital health, scaled companies in digital health that are at kind of the growth scale, that are producing talent that have grown up in digital health as an industry and actually have seen the power of the intersection of healthcare and technology, kind of in a native fashion. Those are the folks who are now coming out and saying, I want to go start a company based on that experience set. So the quality, the level of rigor of understanding of the healthcare domain with the tech lens is orders of magnitude greater than it ever has been in the past, because you now have these new pools of talent that are coming out of these digital health environments that truly understand the intersection of healthcare and technology.
How are we doing on diversity of founders? It used to be that 20 years ago they all looked like I did, but how are we doing on the diversity side?
Yeah, I mean, admittedly, it's still early days. I think, there's plenty of stats available out there, whether it's gender diversity, whether it's, socioeconomic diversity, et cetera, ethnicity. So, still lots of headroom for improvement. I would say that, one of the silver linings of the pandemic was that in many ways it was a great equalizer in terms of access to capital. It used to be the case that you'd have to buy an expensive plane ticket and come to Sand Hill Road and, try to get a meeting with someone in person to be able to pitch and raise financing for your company. I think what happened in the last couple of years has clearly, flipped that on its head and said, you know what, we have to go find the founders. We have to go connect with them through digital means and make ourselves accessible on social media, on kind of virtual channels, et cetera, which I think has really flipped the dynamic in a positive way and therefore makes capital accessible to many folks who would have otherwise not had the wherewithal to, again, get on that plane and kind of physically come to the centers of gravity of venture capital. So I think there's lots of tailwinds like that I think are a very positive force in continuing to drive much of that needed change.
Good. Well, we need to do that. Turning to Day Zero, why did you join the advisory council of Day Zero, Julie?
So first of all, it's a bunch of my friends who I've had an amazing time, building, stuff with. Folks like Gary. Gary was on my board. Aaron is actually on my board as well at Kyruus. And folks like Lynn, who are just icons, from kind of the venture capital space in healthcare. So first and foremost, it was just a great, kind of fellowship opportunity to be with the best and the brightest in the industry. I would say the kind of more fundamental reason is, as someone who was an entrepreneur, one of my, basically the only sort of business book that I read and kind of treated as my Bible was Ben Horowitz's book. It's The Hard Thing About Hard Things. The
Right.
reason that it resonated for me was that every other business book talks about after the fact, looking back romantically on the experience of building a really tough business. Here are the learnings. Everything seems very clean, very principled, very high level. Ben's book was like, all right, we're going to take off the gloves and we're going to talk about the real shit that happens and really how hard it is, and waking up in the morning in a cold sweat, not knowing whether you're going to be able to make payroll the next day. That visceral description of what's really happening on the ground in the earliest days of company formation. That's real. That's what I went through, and that's why it resonated. So I love the notion of Day Zero in that rather than interview founders after the fact when they've had their glory and can talk again romantically about their past experiences and from arm's length, let's talk to the founders who are in the arena right now and going through the real stuff and really get a visceral feel for what that's like. So that concept really resonated.
High five on that one. Julie, thanks so much. We can't wait for your interviews of these founders. It'll be very, very interesting for our audience. So thanks again for your time.
Thanks so much for having me, Gary.